Khamenei did not spend his final months preparing to survive. He spent them preparing to die, not in the theatrical sense, not as a martyr, not as a symbolic sacrifice. He prepared structurally, architecturally, mechanically. He redesigned a military system so that his assassination would not decapitate it, it would activate it. That distinction is everything. Most regimes centralize power, remove the leader, and paralysis follows. Orders stall, units wait, successors hesitate. Negotiation channels reopen because someone, somewhere, wants to stabilize the situation. Khamenei understood that logic, and he dismantled it. By the end of 2026's ceasefire window, Iran's military doctrine had been quietly rewritten. What emerged was not a hierarchy. It was a lattice, not a command chain, a command web, decentralized launch authority, pre-authorized escalation ladders, autonomous operational cells. Every IRGC regional commander received sealed engagement protocols tied not to live command confirmation, but to predefined trigger events. One of those triggers was explicit: leadership elimination. In other words, the moment the supreme leader was killed, the system would not pause. It would begin. This was not improvisation after the strike. It was structural inevitability before it. Operation Epic Fury assumed decapitation would fracture cohesion. It assumed competing factions would scramble for control. It assumed that removing the head would weaken the body. Instead, the removal of the head completed the circuit. The European Council on Foreign Relations described Iran's posture this week with clinical precision: a decentralized system for wartime conditions. That phrase matters, not emergency powers, not chaos response, not contingency fallback. A system built for war without a head. And when the strike came Saturday morning, when the supreme leader was confirmed dead, there was no emergency summit inside Tehran debating retaliation. There was no delay. Missile units activated under pre-cleared engagement rules. Drone swarms launched from distributed depots. Proxy networks initiated synchronized pressure operations. No new order was required. The order already existed. This is where the strategic trap becomes visible. When the United States negotiated with the Taliban in 2020, negotiations worked. The men at the table controlled the fighters in the field. Authority mattered. Khamenei engineered a system where authority after his death became irrelevant. Every senior commander eliminated in follow-on strikes closed a diplomatic channel. Every leadership target neutralized, reduced the number of individuals capable of ceasefire. And by Monday afternoon, the United States found itself confronting a reality that was structurally designed to produce one specific answer. Who do we call to stop this? Silence. Not because Iran has no leaders, it does, but because no surviving leader possesses unilateral authority to countermand the pre-authorized war plan. This is not chaos, it is the opposite. It is continuity without recall. There is a concept in nuclear strategy called the dead hand, an automated retaliation system. Its purpose is not tactical, it is psychological. It tells an adversary, killing us changes nothing. Khamenei did not build a nuclear dead hand, he built a conventional one. Decentralized, drone-based, missile-saturated, economically targeted. Operation Epic Fury sought regime collapse through leadership removal. The expectation was fragmentation. Instead, what emerged was automation. The Gulf infrastructure, now under sustained attack, is not being directed in real time from a war room. It is being executed by commanders following scripts. The system was designed for exactly this moment. And here is the strategic implication. When retaliation does not depend on survival, deterrence changes. Because deterrence traditionally assumes that killing leadership weakens response. Khamenei inverted that assumption. He made his death the ignition sequence, and 5 days in, the machine is still running. The architecture of no recall. To understand why this cannot be switched off, you have to understand how it was built. Traditional military systems are vertical. Orders move downward. Information moves upward. Authority sits at the top, break the top, and the system stalls. Khamenei replaced the vertical model with distributed authorization layers. Each regional command was given conditional autonomy tied to predefined trigger scenarios. Not vague scenarios, specific ones. Leadership decapitation, mass casualty strikes on sovereign soil, energy infrastructure sabotage attributed externally. Under those triggers, escalation pathways were not debated, they were activated. The operational packets were written months ago, target matrices finalized, logistics pre-positioned, launch permissions pre-cleared. This matters because it removes hesitation. Hesitation is where diplomacy lives. When a commander must wait for confirmation, there is a window. When a political council must convene, there is a delay. Delay creates negotiation space. Khamenei eliminated delay. The post-strike environment was supposed to generate confusion, competing power centers, Security Council infighting. Instead, clarity was embedded. Every missile battery knew its assigned phase. Every drone depot knew its sortie window. Every proxy militia had synchronized activation codes. The system did not require coordination after the strike because coordination happened before it. The diplomatic layer is signaling, the military layer is executing. They are no longer dependent on one another. In centralized systems, diplomacy can halt military action. In decentralized systems, diplomacy becomes informational theater. The European security assessments describe Iran's posture as resilient under leadership loss. That phrase is understated. It is not resilient. It is indifferent. Indifferent to decapitation, indifferent to removal of senior commanders. The only lever that could have halted escalation was a living supreme leader. He is gone, which means the framework is self-sustaining. Distributed command structures are harder to map. Centralized systems produce intelligence signals, meetings, orders. Decentralized systems fragment those signals. Activity appears local, not centrally directed. Patterns are harder to detect. The result is something that looks chaotic from the outside, but is internally structured. This is not an insurgency improvising. It is a state military executing a pre-death doctrine. Escalating further does not necessarily restore leverage, because leverage assumes there is someone capable of conceding. In a system designed to run without a central decision-maker, pressure does not produce surrender. It produces continuation. Khamenei's final act was not retaliation. It was insulation. He insulated the war from negotiation by removing the structural necessity of leadership survival. And once a war no longer requires leaders to function, stopping it becomes exponentially harder. The illusion of negotiation. Tuesday morning looked on the surface like de-escalation, back-channel messages, European intermediaries, signals of possible talks. Publicly, Washington framed it as progress. The narrative was clean, pressure worked, leadership removed, infrastructure degraded, Tehran reaching out. But the timeline tells a different story, because while diplomatic feelers were circulating, missile salvos continued. Drone waves did not slow, energy choke points remained under pressure. If negotiations were genuine, operational tempo would have shifted. It did not. This is where strategic misreading becomes dangerous. In centralized regimes, diplomatic outreach signals internal debate. It suggests factions competing for control. It implies someone wants off the escalation ladder. But in a decentralized command system, diplomacy can exist without affecting the battlefield. The political tier can signal flexibility while the military tier continues executing pre-authorized objectives. That is not contradiction. That is layered strategy. Ali Larjani's four-word statement, "We will not negotiate," was not a rejection of diplomacy. It was a reinforcement of structural reality. He was not speaking about back-channel communication. He was signaling to the military layer, to the commanders executing Phase 2, to the units operating under Khamenei's pre-death authorization. The message was clear. The operational plan remains intact. This dual-track strategy accomplishes three objectives simultaneously. First, it manages international optics. European states can tell their domestic audiences that dialogue remains possible. Markets receive temporary reassurance. Escalation appears containable. Second, it complicates American response calibration. If Washington believes negotiations are imminent, it may delay further strikes. That delay allows operational objectives to continue accumulating impact. Third, it preserves internal cohesion. Hardline commanders see public refusal to negotiate and remain committed. Diplomatic envoys see private flexibility and remain engaged. It is controlled ambiguity. But the deeper issue is structural. Negotiation requires authority. Authority requires hierarchy. Hierarchy no longer governs the escalation mechanism. When the supreme leader was alive, he could have ordered a ceasefire and expected compliance. Now, any surviving political figure attempting unilateral de-escalation would confront a pre-authorized military structure that does not require their consent to continue. This is not theoretical. IRGC units are not waiting for new instructions. They are operating under standing engagement protocols. And those protocols were triggered the moment decapitation occurred. The United States assumed removing leadership would create bargaining space. Instead, it removed the only individual capable of binding the system to a binding ceasefire. There is a brutal irony here. The more successful the decapitation campaign was, the fewer negotiation nodes remain. Every eliminated senior commander closed a potential channel. Every destroyed leadership cluster reduced the number of individuals who could credibly say, "Stop." And so Washington now faces a paradox. Escalation continues. Diplomacy signals exist, but no single voice controls both. This is what makes the situation structurally unstable. Because wars end when someone can decide to end them. Khamenei designed a system where that decision is no longer centralized. And without centralized recall, negotiations become atmospheric. The missiles continue regardless. The economic battlefield. The strikes are not random. The targets are not symbolic. They are economic pressure points mapped long before February 28th. Look at the pattern. LNG terminals, desalination facilities, financial districts, tourism corridors, air defense saturation points near American bases. This is not an attempt to defeat the United States militarily in open confrontation. It is an attempt to alter the cost calculus of every government aligned with Washington. Khamenei understood something critical. America can absorb military losses. It can tolerate overseas instability. It can even weather prolonged conflict if the domestic economy remains insulated. But the Gulf cannot. The Gulf's stability is fragile because it is built on perception. Perception of safety, perception of uninterrupted energy flow, perception of economic inevitability. Missiles striking energy infrastructure do not just damage facilities. They spike global prices. They strain European industrial production. They ripple through Asian supply chains. When LNG exports pause, Germany feels it. When shipping insurance premiums surge, Japan feels it. When oil futures jump, markets everywhere feel it. And this is distributed pressure, not against Washington directly, but against Washington's coalition. If Qatar's export terminals shut down, European leaders face industrial contraction. If Dubai's skyline becomes a symbol of vulnerability, capital flight accelerates. If insurance markets classify the Gulf as high risk, investment slows. The pain is not concentrated. It is networked. The Sufin Center described the objective succinctly. Raise the cost faster than the adversary can tolerate it. Cost acceleration. The Gulf states hosted American bases. They provided airspace. They facilitated logistics. Now they experience retaliation not as symbolic reprisal, but as economic destabilization. Missile interceptors are expensive. Sustained salvos deplete defensive inventories faster than replenishment can occur. Interceptors costing millions are used to stop drones costing thousands. This asymmetry matters because prolonged saturation drains both budgets and confidence. And confidence is the Gulf's most valuable commodity. Here is the strategic inversion. The United States sought to demonstrate overwhelming capability through decapitation. Instead, the retaliation demonstrates distributed vulnerability. Hotels burn in cities previously considered untouchable. Insurance markets reprice risk overnight. Tourism evaporates. Energy markets tighten. This is not battlefield attrition. It is reputational attrition. The longer the system runs, the more international pressure builds. Not on Tehran, but on Washington. European leaders begin calling for restraint. Asian importers demand stabilization. Gulf monarchies quietly ask how long American protection can realistically shield them. And that is the pivot point. Because when allies begin asking whether guarantees are sustainable, strategic credibility erodes. Khamenei's design does not need to win militarily. It needs to sustain disruption long enough that coalition cohesion weakens. Every day the machine runs, pressure compounds. Across the Gulf, across Europe, across Asia. And the longer it compounds, the harder it becomes for Washington to claim that decapitation restored control. The strategic trap. There is a moment in every conflict where the options narrow. Not because the battlefield dictates it, because structure does. Washington now faces three theoretical paths: escalate, negotiate, contain. Each one assumes something that may no longer exist. Escalation assumes that greater force produces leverage, but leverage requires a pressure point, a centralized command node, a leadership council capable of override, a hierarchy that values survival over continuation. Khamenei removed that pressure point. Further decapitation strikes remove individuals, not authorization. The machine does not depend on personality anymore. It depends on protocol. Negotiation assumes a binding authority, someone who can sit across a table and guarantee compliance, someone who can pick up a phone and say, "Stand down," and be obeyed. But every senior commander eliminated was a potential guarantor. Every leadership cluster destroyed reduced the pool of credible negotiators. The surviving three-member council does not command the operational lattice. It coexists with it. That distinction is critical. Containment assumes time is neutral, that the conflict can be stabilized at its current intensity, that Gulf states can absorb periodic strikes, that energy markets can normalize under persistent risk. But containment favors the side with structural endurance. The decentralized architecture was built for longevity. Distributed depots, autonomous units, redundant communication channels. It was engineered to survive sustained pressure. The longer the conflict continues, the more coalition fatigue accumulates. Insurance premiums rise, defense inventories shrink, political patience erodes. And here is the deeper layer. Strategic credibility is not measured by battlefield statistics. It is measured by perception of control. When the United States cannot answer a simple question, who do we call? The perception shifts. Not publicly, not immediately, but quietly. Allies begin hedging, back channels multiply. Independent security initiatives accelerate, not because America is defeated, because certainty is gone. This is how superpowers lose leverage without losing wars. Not through collapse, through diffusion. Khamenei's design forces Washington into a dilemma. Escalate further and risk regional conflagration without guaranteeing termination. Negotiate without a binding authority and risk appearing reactive. Contain while economic and reputational costs compound. Each option carries strategic erosion. This is what makes the trap effective. It is not about military symmetry. It is about decision paralysis. When every available path carries structural disadvantage, time favors the side that pre-authorized endurance. 5 days in, the machine continues. The diplomatic layer floats above it. The economic pressure compounds beneath it, and Washington is left operating inside a framework it did not design. The most dangerous conflicts are not those with overwhelming force. They are those where the architecture was built before the first strike. Khamenei did not attempt to outmatch American power. He redesigned the rules under which that power operates, and once the rules change, superiority does not guarantee control, it only guarantees impact. Control requires recall, and recall no longer exists. The dead hand logic. There's a reason the Soviet dead hand system terrified Western planners. Not because it made war more likely, because it made stopping war harder. The logic was simple. If Moscow's leadership was eliminated in a first strike, an automated system would detect it and launch retaliation without human confirmation. No debate, no hesitation, no recall. The entire deterrence framework of the Cold War rested on rational actors making rational decisions. The dead hand replaced rational decision with structural inevitability. Khamenei's architecture operates on the same principle, but in a conventional domain. It is not nuclear. It does not guarantee immediate annihilation. But it guarantees continuation. That distinction matters. In a traditional escalation ladder, both sides climb and descend based on signaling. One side increases pressure, the other responds proportionally. But when retaliation is pre-authorized and decentralized, signaling loses leverage. Killing leadership no longer signals dominance. It activates pre-scripted escalation. Destroying command nodes no longer paralyzes. It disperses. This is the core destabilizer. American doctrine assumes decapitation reduces operational coherence. That assumption has been validated repeatedly against hierarchical adversaries like Iraq and ISIS. Khamenei inverted that assumption. He assumed decapitation was inevitable. He designed the response to make decapitation irrelevant. Because now, the only side capable of halting escalation unilaterally is the side that initiated it. Iran's decentralized network does not require new orders. It requires endurance. And endurance favors the architect who planned for death. Automated retaliation systems reduce miscalculation in one domain but increase it in another. They prevent paralysis, but also prevent flexibility. Once triggered, the system prioritizes execution over adaptation. That rigidity creates danger, not because architects miscalculated, because opponents misread. If Washington assumes pressure will force a negotiating pivot, it may escalate further, believing a breaking point exists. But in a system designed to operate without leadership override, the breaking point may not manifest where expected. The decentralized structure does not signal distress through central panic. It continues until structural resources are exhausted. Khamenei removed discretion from retaliation, enough that the first 5 days of conflict have followed the pre-written script almost exactly. This is not improvisation. It is design. And once war becomes a function of design, escalation becomes mechanical. Mechanical systems do not respond to persuasion. They respond to depletion. The question is, which side reaches structural exhaustion first? Because in a conflict governed by pre-authorization, endurance is leverage, and Khamenei engineered his final act to maximize it. The coalition fracture line. Wars between two states are dangerous. Wars that stretch across alliances are destabilizing. Because alliances are not built on emotion. They are built on calculation. Every government currently aligned with Washington is recalculating in real time. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly. The Gulf monarchies hosted American bases because the protection seemed absolute. The cost-benefit equation was simple. Allow infrastructure access, receive security guarantees. That equation is now under stress. Missiles landing near desalination plants. Drones targeting LNG export hubs. Interceptors firing nightly at significant financial cost. Security guarantees only hold if they eliminate vulnerability. They are failing to eliminate it. That does not mean the United States is powerless. It means the protection is not total. And in geopolitics, not total becomes uncertain. Uncertainty changes behavior. Energy exporters begin hedging with alternative security partners. Financial capitals quietly open parallel diplomatic channels. Insurance markets reprice risk in ways that alter investment flows. None of this requires a public rupture. It requires doubt. Doubt is corrosive. It spreads faster than missile debris. Europe is watching closely. European industry depends heavily on Gulf energy stability. LNG shipments are not abstract commodities. They are inputs to manufacturing lines in Germany, Italy, and Eastern Europe. If export terminals remain intermittently offline, European leaders face economic contraction. Economic contraction produces political consequences. Political consequences produce calls for de-escalation. The pressure does not fall on Tehran first. It falls on Washington. Asia's response follows a similar logic. Japan, South Korea, and India rely on uninterrupted energy flows through maritime corridors. If shipping lanes are perceived as vulnerable, insurance premiums rise. Freight costs surge, industrial margins shrink. Governments facing domestic inflation rarely support prolonged instability. This is the cascade Khamenei anticipated. Not a military cascade, a diplomatic one. Alliances are strongest when the leader appears in control. They weaken when control appears contested. The silence in that room, the unanswered question about who to call, reverberates outward. Not because it signals defeat, because it signals uncertainty, and uncertainty invites hedging. Hedging does not look like betrayal. It looks like diversification. More diplomatic contact with Beijing, more defense procurement discussions with Moscow, more regional autonomy conversations inside NATO. The fracture does not begin as a crack. It begins as an adjustment to small recalibrations in posture, small rhetorical shifts, small procurement decisions that signal a world no longer singularly anchored to American security dominance. Khamenei's architecture was not designed to win in open battle. It was designed to outlast confidence. If confidence erodes, coalition unity softens. If coalition unity softens, pressure disperses, and dispersed pressure is survivable. The longer the decentralized system runs, the more the strategic burden shifts from Tehran to Washington. Because Washington must reassure every ally simultaneously. Tehran only needs to endure. Endurance strains coalitions faster than it strains centralized power. And 5 days in, the coalition recalibration has already begun, quietly, predictably, exactly as designed. The American dilemma. There is a misconception that power equals control. It does not. Power equals capability. Control requires structure. Right now, the United States has overwhelming capability. Carrier strike groups, strategic bombers, precision weapons, surveillance dominance. But capability does not automatically translate into control over escalation, because escalation is no longer centrally directed on the opposing side. And that creates the dilemma. If Washington escalates further, broader strikes, deeper infrastructure targeting, expanded decapitation attempts, it risks feeding the architecture. The decentralized network does not weaken under pressure. It activates further nodes, destroy one depot, another launches. Eliminate one commander, another executes pre-cleared authority. Escalation becomes fuel. But restraint carries its own cost. If Washington pauses, it appears reactive. Allies question resolve. Adversaries test boundaries elsewhere. And that is the strategic vice. Escalate and risk uncontrollable spread. Pause and risk perception of weakness. This is what structural traps look like. Not dramatic collapse, constrained options. There is also a domestic dimension. Modern conflicts do not unfold in isolation. They unfold under constant media exposure and financial volatility. Energy prices spike. Markets fluctuate. Images of burning Gulf skylines circulate instantly. Every day the decentralized system continues firing. The conflict occupies bandwidth, political bandwidth, economic bandwidth, psychological bandwidth. And in democracies, bandwidth matters. Extended uncertainty erodes public patience. Military planners understand this. His design does not require decisive battlefield victory. It requires duration. Because duration stresses democracies more than it stresses authoritarian command structures. The American military can sustain operations. The American political system must sustain consensus. Consensus is harder. There is another factor. War games repeatedly demonstrated that conflicts in this region would not be clean. Supply chains are vulnerable. Stockpiles are finite. Multi-theater commitments stretch readiness. If simultaneous crises emerge, resource allocation becomes complex. The decentralized structure does not need to win everywhere. It needs to persist long enough to stretch American bandwidth thin. This is the inversion of traditional deterrence. Deterrence assumes escalation is controlled by centralized, rational actors. Khamenei's system reduces the number of centralized actors capable of rational recalibration. That shifts the burden entirely onto Washington. And Washington now confronts a war that does not behave like previous wars. There is no singular command node to pressure, no clear decapitation target to reset the board, no guaranteed diplomatic counterpart with binding authority. The architecture transformed a conventional confrontation into a structural endurance test. Power remains overwhelming. Control is uncertain. And when control becomes uncertain, even overwhelming power feels constrained. This is not about immediate defeat. It is about strategic friction. The longer friction persists, the more options narrow. And the narrowing is precisely what the architecture was designed to produce. The escalation horizon. There is a phase in every conflict when analysts stop asking what happened and begin asking what happens next. We are in that phase now. Because the first 5 days have confirmed something structural, the system is functioning exactly as designed. The next question is whether it can be stretched beyond its design limits. Escalation does not always arrive dramatically. It often arrives incrementally. Longer missile ranges, broader target sets, cyber disruptions layered on physical strikes. The decentralized framework allows for phased expansion. Phase 1 pressures infrastructure. Phase 2 widens economic pain. Phase 3 could test direct maritime choke points. Each phase is pre-authorized. Each escalation step reduces ambiguity. The risk is not immediate collapse, it is cumulative normalization. If Gulf infrastructure remains intermittently under fire for weeks, markets begin pricing that instability permanently. If shipping lanes experience periodic closure, global logistics reroute structurally. American bases move from projection to protection. And projection is the essence of superpower status. This is the escalation horizon, not a sudden explosion, a gradual widening. The United States retains options. Direct strikes on deeper military infrastructure, expanded cyber operations, broader regional coalition mobilization. But each option increases complexity, and complexity in decentralized conflicts behaves unpredictably. Shock does not paralyze, it disperses. That dispersion makes escalation nonlinear. A strike may trigger distributed responses in multiple domains simultaneously. Missile salvos, maritime harassment, cyber intrusions, proxy mobilization. This multi-vector dynamic complicates de-escalation. Traditional war termination theory relies on exhaustion or decisive advantage, but exhaustion requires identifiable breaking points, and decisive advantage requires centralized surrender authority. Neither condition currently exists. There is also the perception dimension. If Washington appears unable to halt ongoing retaliation, adversaries elsewhere take note. Taiwan calculus shifts. Baltic risk assessments adjust. Strategic reputation is about controlling wars. The escalation horizon tests control. This conflict reframes global power perception, not because the United States lacks force, because the system it confronted was engineered to endure force. This is the difference between tactical superiority and structural dominance. Tactical superiority wins battles. Structural dominance determines duration. The decentralized architecture shifts the fight to a time horizon. Every additional day the system continues, escalation becomes normalized. Every normalized escalation step reduces shock value, and once shock value diminishes, the threshold for the next step lowers. This is how conflicts widen, not through singular catastrophic decisions, through layered persistence. The next 72 hours matter, not because of headlines, because of pattern confirmation. If the system continues uninterrupted, it validates the architecture's endurance. At that point, the question is no longer who fired first. It becomes who can sustain longer. And in endurance contests, structure decides outcomes. What this really means. This is not a story about a single strike. It is not a story about one leader or one decision. It is a story about architecture, about what happens when a system is engineered for the exact scenario its adversary believes will end it. Khamenei did not try to outgun the United States. He did not try to match carriers with carriers or bombers with bombers. He redesigned the rules of response. He removed the dependency on survival. He built continuity without recall. And once that structure was triggered, the logic of control shifted. The United States still possesses overwhelming force. But force is not the same as leverage. Leverage requires a pressure point. It requires someone who can say, stop, and have it obeyed. Right now, that pressure point may not exist. The silence in that room, who do we call, was not a tactical problem. It was structural recognition. Recognition that decapitation did not produce paralysis. It produced activation. And the longer this conflict runs under that activation model, the more strategic friction accumulates. Across the Gulf, across Europe, across Asia, the decentralized system does not guarantee victory for Tehran. It guarantees duration, and duration shifts the battlefield to endurance economics. If escalation continues, it will not look like cinematic war. It will look like persistent instability, energy volatility, alliance recalibration. The real question now is not who is stronger, it is who adapts faster. Can Washington recalibrate its doctrine to confront a system designed to survive decapitation? Can diplomatic channels be rebuilt where none exist? Because this conflict is not being fought only with missiles. It is being fought with architecture, and architecture outlasts individuals. If this analysis gave you clarity, then do one simple thing. Like this video so more people see it. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The world has entered a new strategic era, one where killing the head no longer stops the body. Once you understand that, you can't unsee it.